Yeah, sorry. My question is about what's going on with France right now. Currently, the general strike is underway. I know you guys are probably going to touch on that, but I was just wondering, what do you guys think is the possibility that something like that is possible in the United States?
That's a good question. Let me let you go, and we will answer it. In fact, let's show some footage of. It was about 1.5 million people who supposedly protested yesterday. It was a general strike across the country to protest austerity. And here is a clip of, and I don't know where this is. I think this was in Paris, but and it is in Paris. Police officers moving in on protesters, and the firefighters, Parisian firefighters, basically got to the front of the marching protesters with their hands up and basically walked the police backwards.
I'm curious how police are trained, if they're trained to avoid this sort of symbolic type of retreat like this, because they don't want to smash firemen's heads in because they're telling them to move back, but it does look bad for them.
In Paris or in America?
That's another good
smash anybody's head in America. I mean, but they people should know. I mean, they've been extremely brutal, actually, at all of the Yellow Vest protests. There's a lot of footage you can look up of Parisian police, like, cracking heads with the best of them globally. So this is not like friendly police, what I'm trying to say.
There's just a completely different, I think, just a cultural value to protest in these countries. Now, part of it is that the governments are far more responsive, frankly, to protest. But I mean, 1.5 million people. How many people are in France? I mean, I'm trying to figure out what the equivalent of.
Like 40 million?
I think it's 40 million. I will say on the flip
side, you're
side,
talking about the equivalent of really something like 15 million people in this country in one day protesting, and the closest I think we've ever had is probably. Maybe 1 million plus during the Iraq War, and in any given day. But it's also, you got to remember, I guess the population is 67 million in France.
And those were protests. Those weren't general strikes that shut down the country.
They weren't strikes, no. And we haven't had that type of like labor action, like sort of broad labor action since like the Wildcat strike.
We're a number of dialectic stages away from that sort of thing in America.
Well, there's a reason for that, and it's that the early versions of the police here were founded primarily to put down these labor actions in a really violent way.
The Pinkertons, yeah.
And it just developed from there. And if we think that wouldn't happen again, if there was widespread labor unrest here, we're wrong, but that doesn't mean that it's not possible.
Just jump in quickly. I mean, yeah, there's been just an entire, essentially erosion of the labor movement. But also, I would have to, contend that our political and media culture is one that entirely devalues mass politics, right? The idea of mass political movements, just in their role in shaping our history of change, of political change in this country, has been kind of entirely painted over in favor of a more electorally focused, in vaguer sort of narrative that paints like every movement as being kind of this pursuit of getting enough literal information to the right electoral candidate, to the right politicians, who then reify the demands of the civil rights movement or the women's rights movement or the LGBTQ movement into law once they find out enough information. You can see it now too. There's such a disdain for the idea that, okay, well, how are people going to get Medicare for all the past? Are they going to be marching in the streets? Are they going to be marching in the streets demanding that Mitch McConnell pass the law? That might not work. It might not work in America depending on what happens in response to it. But for those people who think like that, I wonder what they think has led to the changes that we've seen throughout the history of America, right? Over the past 200 years. It's like they don't seem to have that understanding of history.
Well, it also sort of feels like people think that things don't change. I mean, I think if your entire political life was your inputs were, basically mid 70s until now. You would look at, to the extent that there were protests and say it really was meaningless.
But you wouldn't see a systemic. But I think you're right, though. I mean, I think that the narratives we tell are about like there's so many accounts of even really important meetings, but King came in and met with Johnson, and there were a bunch of people outside. And there was a bunch of stuff happening, but it's the meeting that mattered. And it's actually, really, it was the people outside creating the context for the meeting. I would say in a way, Colombia might be more similar to who we are than France in terms of a right-wing, political and obviously more violent, but extremely anti-union movement. They've been going for a while now. And just a couple of days ago, a very hard right president just had to publicly, in fact, acknowledge what they were doing. And I don't trust Duque for a second, but they did put enough heat on the streets for a very reactionary president to not only listen to wage demands, but part of what they're protesting about is honoring the peace deal with the FARC, which goes to the entirety of the whole reason that guy is president. And here, to your point, Sam, in Colombia, there is a right-wing part of the electorate. That is not all top down from the elites. Right-wing candidates win national elections. So that's having that result in Colombia, which I would say is more analogous to here than France.
Yeah, I mean,
so
people voted for Trump
it matters.
Here. Here's why I've got some hope for the future of class struggle in this country. The more I learn about history and the history of class struggle, which some might say is all history, throughout the course of our country's history, capital has always found a way to buy their way out of class struggle. It used to be with the Western frontier. We don't have that anymore. It used to be with home ownership and Levittown and suburban communities that were planned to be a civilizing, a conservative force on the average American worker and make them think that I've got about as good a life as my boss does. It keeps them from being congregated, keeps them from congregating after work. I think it was Levitt himself who said a man who owns a home could never be a communist. And those things have gone away, and I don't think that they're coming back. My generation, we're never going to own anything. We don't really want to. A lot of us don't want to own anything. We would much rather have nice public housing that we can live in and not pay too much in rent than this house that we just sink all of our savings and our money into. So I have hope for the future because I don't think that these things are coming back.
Well, that was sort of my point was, if you looked only at the last 40 years and just assumed that we were going to, this is the new normal and this is always going to be this way. But I think, different generations emerge under different contexts, and what becomes possible again changes. And so you see this reemergence of teacher strikes over the past couple of years and sort of an increasing number of strikes, labor actions. You start to think that maybe the way that people are getting oriented has changed. So,
and even UBI is another version of what you're talking about. Sorry, go ahead.
No, and I'm also optimistic as well. I think that now that we have a lot of industries, a lot of the major labor movements and strikes of the early, 20th century, late 20th century, early, the late 19th century, early 20th century were in the coal industry, in the carbon industry, and in manufacturing, and in these industries that had the ability to grind, these industries that employed lots of people and had the ability to grind society to a halt in a way that we're finally getting to another place again where we have these fast food, Walmart, these large scale, Amazon, these people, these organizations that employ a large segment of the population, and these people can have, if not class solidarity, labor solidarity. We do the same thing. We all,
right.
we all package boxes.
Well, I think also, one of the things that, and I probably referenced this book maybe more than any other book that we've done this year was. What was it? The one about the GM. I can't remember what wrecked. Yeah, that I suspect. I don't know this for a fact, but I suspect that places like Walmart and Amazon have structured their workforce in such a way that it does not have the vulnerabilities, let's say, that the car companies had in the 50s to a small number of employees. basically destroying the supply chain by being able to just step out of it and halting everything in production. I mean, they had a lot more labor leverage. Few people had more sort of leverage than I suspect that people have today. Like, I mean, yes, there is a more solidarity insofar as like we have the same. I live in Arkansas and I live in Georgia, or I live in Maine, and our lives are actually strikingly similar because of the nature of the work that we do. Makes it somewhat easier to organize, but you need to have mass movements there, as opposed to like 50 people working in one part of the supply chain that can stop production on the line, and so you can have redundancy in terms of the labor action. And it's like, okay, we got the guys doing the ball bearings for the steering, the rack and pin steering, and they're not delivering. And then also the guys delivering the brake pads are not delivering, and it's wiped out our entire production.
Some guy who was a labor organizer told me years ago, he was like, if you're actually interested in like the future of how this stuff is going to work and strategies, you need to read like business management books. You should read books about like zero time management or Edward S. Deming and all of these ideas coming from MIT about how you actually like build a factory for maximum efficiency.
Because then you can find the weak part and you take it out.
Yeah.
Call from an 810